The holidays are just around the corner, and if you're feeling some mixed emotions of excitement and dread, I know the feeling. Sometimes you just have to think about what matters most to you and keep focused on the things that bring you joy. But you may also benefit from a little bit of help and focus on body kindness. So I invite you to join me in our wonderful body kindness community. Visit bodykindnessbook.com and click Get Started. When you give your name and email, you will get instant access to the free Body Kindness mini e-course. I'll be checking in with you over email, and you'll get invited to join our group on Facebook. If you have questions, shoot me an email. It's Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. Hey listeners, thank you so much for joining me on the Body Kindness podcast. I am bringing you a special episode. So yes, we are still in the middle of our series about body stories, and I've been getting great feedback on those. But I am really excited to bring you an interview that is very timely with some things that are going on in our culture with respect to the sexual harassment and abuse that is occurring in politics and also in celebrity culture. And so you're actually going to get 2 interviews with Jaclyn Friedman. So the first one we recorded a couple of months ago before I was about to hit a little bit of travel in my own schedule. And it was about her upcoming book, which is now out. Well, a lot of the topics in her upcoming book were related to stuff that's been happening in the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to see if she would talk with me for a few minutes about what was happening in current events, and kind of if she had a do-over for her book, what she would have included and why. And I think it's going to be really helpful. I'm so excited to bring this to you. I just want to introduce Jaclyn before we get into our conversations. So Jaclyn Friedman's work has really redefined the concept of, quote, healthy sexuality, and popularized the yes means yes standard of sexual consent that's quickly becoming law on many U.S. college campuses. She's a popular speaker and opinion writer and the creator of 3 books: Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape, What You Really Want, The Smart Girl's Shame-Free Guide to Sex and Safety, and the newly released Unscrewed, Women, Sex, Power, and How to Stop Letting the System Screw Us All. Friedman hosts Unscrewed. It's a critically acclaimed podcast exploring paths to sexual liberation. And she is a great gal. She's going to be on book tour. I'm going to include the link to the tour in the show notes, a couple of links to what we're talking about, but you'd have to be on vacation somewhere without internet or under a rock to really not know of the New York Times article with respect to Harvey Weinstein sexual harassment that is currently going on, Louis C.K. and others. And so we're going to dive right in first to about a 25-minute current event conversation. And then following that, you're going to hear our full-length initial podcast interview. And hope you enjoy it. I think it's going to be very eye-opening. I know for me as a parent, I've been wondering about, okay, so my kids are 5, like, what do I do right now? And so I was able to pull out some of those tidbits of tips and information. But really, we're all kind of processing, okay, what does this mean about systems of power and what can we do at an individual and community level? And I just think that it's a very important part of how we create a better world. And also, I think a place where we can feel more free to enjoy our own bodies and to enjoy our sexuality, whatever it is and how we're defining that. So it does relate to body kindness and how our bodies experience the world. So I hope it's helpful. And here's the show. I feel like even if I try to run and hide from the news and social media, everywhere you turn lately has been just another, in a way it feels amazing, right? With Me Too and just with women and men and anyone who has been harmed in the past by sexual harassment. What's another strong word I could use here? Oppressions,
I tend to say sexual abuse
Oh,
because
there we go. Yeah.
it covers a whole gamut of things.
Right. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of like, when there was, I guess, because there was the New York Times article. I don't even know if do you have like a timeline of how it all started happening? The bottom line is there's been this I'm grateful for this outpouring of people feeling like they can come forward and also being held accountable. So I feel like you're the expert here, not me. And I'm just so glad that you could come on and kind of update us all on like what's happening, why is it wrong, how, not that we need that much of an explanation on why it's wrong, but like how does it relate to stuff you talk about in the book? Because I feel like if you were still writing your manuscript, you'd be like,
oh my God, there are a couple
fodder.
of chapters that I really want to go back and edit. I want to go back and edit the like religious right chapter and talk about this whole Roy Moore business.
Yes, let's start there.
Okay,
bring it in.
That chapter is all about the way the religious right is tangled up in our government. And this Roy Moore thing is like, this is a guy who's made his career by insisting that Christian law should dominate U.S. law and is very close to being elected a senator and has been, attorney general, I think, yes, of Alabama. And twice they kicked him out because he was insisted on imposing Christian law in federal in his court, and then he got reelected because Alabama, I guess. And this is a man who bangs on morality like his entire career, and it turns out that he literally has abused children, right? Like that he had sexually abused a 14-year-old girl, that in his 30s he hit on 16-year-old and 18-year-old girls and quote unquote dated them. And what's bonkers is not just that. I mean, the hypocrisy is something I already talk about in that chapter. This is just a very fresh example. But what's bonkers to me is seeing all of his cronies, also, evangelical Christians, coming out and saying, meh, it's not that bad. Like, it was basically like Joseph and Mary in the Bible. And like, I don't see anything wrong with a 30-something-year-old guy dating a 16-year-old girl as long as he has permission from her mother. And the hypocrisy of it it's so naked in this case, right? You don't have to look. Like when I was writing that chapter, I was talking about some lawmaker or another, and they put forward some, I think, anti-abortion bill, as a way to protect the children, right? And then I had to like look through that legislator's like record for like things that he had voted for that were not protecting children, like letting guns be in school zones. But you don't even have to look for this example. It's just so naked. There are Republican elected or appointed Republican officials who are now saying literally out loud, like, I would rather have a pedophile than a Democrat. Ugh. Like, it's really cool with them, right? Well, it's not cool with them that consenting adults have consensual sex with each other, but it's totally cool if they can manipulate little girls.
Ugh. And then I'm even thinking of the I'm not a person of strong religious faith, but like, what if somebody is, and what if they have a little girl? I've got to think that, for those who are strong in their beliefs, right, it's so easy to be like, this is bullshit, right? But like, what about for people who feel, what I mean? Like that their religion isn't being well represented, or they feel kind of twisted and torn in what they're seeing. I mean, I almost see like kind of additional harm being brought on, Well,
yeah, and I was really careful in that chapter, and when I talk about it, I'm talking about a very particular strain of the religious right. Like this is a very particular political strain of Christianity, which is just solely about wielding power. It's so naked in this case, right? It's just about like, do we get to have control?
Yeah.
But most Christians don't believe in this, right? Like I don't want anyone to confuse like Christianity as a faith with these people. Right. I don't think they're very good Christians, right? I don't think Jesus would be down with them. No. I'm a Jew. What do I know? But it does not seem like that. So I want to be clear about that. And in fact, in that chapter, and I literally don't remember if we talked about this in the original show, but in that chapter, I profile, this woman and this group who's doing amazing work training up pastors and clergy to defend reproductive justice and reproductive rights using the Bible, right? Like,
it's so good. That is so good.
So this is not about bashing Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
It's about exposing this particular strain as what it is, which is just a power grab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it would have, had this been going on when you were working on your MS, this would be like an easy, almost a cakewalk for you to be like, I remember when this happened, and here's your example. So, yeah. Oh.
Yeah. And then I would go back, obviously, and edit the media chapter. The chapter that's like all about Hollywood. You know, and I think I'm a little embarrassed. Like, I don't talk in that chapter except sort of obliquely about the behavior of individual men on sets and in boardrooms in Hollywood and how that impacts. You know, that chapter is mostly about how we have to not talk just about representation, but think about ownership and who gets to control and tell our stories.
And there's a lot going on in Hollywood, right? Because the New York Times article, Ashley Judd came out, right? And said that she was that was Harvey Weinstein, right?
I mean, Harvey Weinstein has been accused by 1 million women at this point. Yeah, so.
Right. And he may even face legal action, right? He's separated from his company now, may face legal action. That's kind of what's going on with him.
But it's not just Harvey Weinstein. Yeah. It's every day it's somebody else in Hollywood. Else. It's Louis C.K., it's George Takei, Matt Weiner, Kevin Spacey. I literally have lost track.
Well, and Kevin Spacey, I mean, it's all bad. But he particularly was called out, if I understand what I was getting on social media, that he hasn't been publicly out as a gay man. And so he kind of he conflated the two, and that upset a lot of people. Well,
yeah, he basically treated it as though the scandal was that he was gay, and not the scandal was that he like bodily assaulted like an underage kid.
Right. Oh, it's just so awful because again, it's like to me, there's so many mistakes. I don't know who was doing what type of work for him on like deflecting the message and how do I do crisis communication? Like that person hopefully is really fired or, and then I said later, okay, I'm seeking help and everything, but I haven't seen him apologize for those original remarks, but I was grateful to see, everybody speak out against how wrong that is, but especially, coming from the gay community, it's like the distancing of this is not okay to do this.
Yeah, it's not the same thing at all, right? It has nothing to do with your sexuality.
Yeah.
But my point being, the sort of larger point being, the thing I wish I had said explicitly was one of the reasons that it's so important to have women in positions of power in terms of making decisions about what stories get told and how they get told is because this is what men do with that power, right? They literally, the men who see women and in some case other men, they see as, toys as to affirm their power. They see sex as an instrument of dominance and subjugation, are telling our cultural stories about sex, right? And the people who are abused, one of the less told stories of this news cycle about Hollywood is the numbers of women, in these stories who they dropped out of the industry, right?
Wow.
And the stories that they could have told never got told because they just dropped out of the industry. I'm thinking about Matt Weiner from Mad Men, who like co-wrote this, what turned out to be an Emmy-winning episode with this woman who he propositioned and she turned him down and then he fired her and she left the industry, right? Like, and she's obviously an enormously talented writer and tons of actresses who've, told stories about one person or another in this past month. So, it's not just that it's a horrible, toxic place to work. It's literally that the people in power are controlling the ideas, the narratives we get exposed to around sex. And the people in power are staying in power by using sex to abuse other people who then get silenced.
Oh, it's so twisted.
Yeah. And I wish that I had made that, had like brought that much more clearly out. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what about, and I've only, who knows who you're Facebook friends with, right? Ever, it's just like, who is this person again? But, and I've not seen any defense, but people will start to ask, well, when is an apology enough? Or what about all the people that are going to get fired as a result? And I'm just like, I'm still not feeling any empathy right now. I mean, yes, I don't like how someone who could lose their job having not done anything wrong. But that part of how it works?
Of someone who's even claiming that. I mean, I hear a lot of people wringing hands about that and being afraid of that. Yeah. But I literally haven't heard from a single man who said, I've been fired and this is wrong. I'm innocent.
Mm-hmm. Like, no. I'm not asking that. Like, say something. And again, I don't have a really good example. Well, this was somebody who was commenting specifically about Louis C.K. and was questioning, but so I don't know if something happened and something got canceled, or people who work for him no longer have jobs, or if that's just an assumption, but it's more like, oh, well, that person who worked for this celebrity is now screwed because, like, it seems to me it's a twisted kind of curiosity or argument, like shit's going to happen and
I imagine
sucks.
A lot of CK's employees are now going to be screwed because he's going to have a lot less work. But like,
that doesn't change anything.
The alternative is like, we just let him off the fucking hook. Like that apology was bullshit on multiple levels. One, he could have issued it at any time. You know, he didn't just wake up and realize this today. And literally as recently as August or September, when he was at the Toronto International Film Festival, he was denying these stories and dismissing them as rumors and laughing them off. Like, he's only acting accountable because he literally has no better choices. Wow. And the other thing is, like, he kept talking about how, like, admired he was. I thought it was really creepy. And instead of saying, like, I have power in this industry, he said it was bad because my power was that I was admired. Right. And I'm not surprised. I think a lot of people who wield that kind of power don't see their power. They just see it as the natural state of things. They don't see it structurally. But it was very creepy the way he denied, like, the actual structural power that he wielded and maybe still wields.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, ultimately, you know, what you're asking for in the book overall with respect to more equality and diversity, and for us to take back, you know, to take back our power. And we did talk in the full show about how the people in power need to in some way be willing to share that power so that some of these problems can get solved. And that's not going to change. That's the root issue still.
You know, and that sharing doesn't happen when we go to them and say, kindly please, right? Like, people in power very rarely just are like, sure, have some.
Right. They'll fight it until, like you said, no other choice. Yeah. I'm backed into a corner. Now I have to come clean. But let me blow this off. Let me brush off responsibility. Like, there's not, you know, and that's part of the issue, is like, there's not real responsibility being taken. And also, like, I kind of feel like, and I mean, it's like, this is a mess right now. Like, how do we create good? Like, can we fix our next generation? Can we fix things now? Like, what is it that we could do? You know, whether we talk Hollywood or politics, you know, like, can you give me like some sort of an example of, like,
I mean, I think the really important thing is that we don't get distracted into thinking these are one-off incidents, right? That we don't get distracted into thinking Hollywood, that there's something specifically rotten about Hollywood or politics, right? Like, I was talking to somebody who also is in the sexuality field the other day, and we were talking about all the creepy men we've encountered in our fields, right? Like, you know, women who work retail will tell you a million creepy stories. Women who work in the fields in agriculture, right? Like, this is at every level. And the reason that we're hearing these particular stories is because these are famous people, and we have a lot of interest in famous people in our culture. But if we only think about these as the problems of famous people and then hold those famous people to accountable, and we don't insist that these actions are taken just as seriously when somebody with no power is targeted by somebody no one has ever heard of, we're not really changing the culture. So we need to look at the communities that we ourselves live in. Each of us has a different set of interlocking communities, and think about whether or not we know about sexual abuse that's happening, sexual abuses of power specifically that are happening in our own communities. And if you haven't heard about them, then probably people don't think you're a person they can talk to, because I promise you they're happening. They happen in every community.
That's just scary. I literally got chills of just thinking about, okay, so in the public school system in Washington, D.C., where my girls are be going to school, there's going to be sexual abuse and child abuse and oppression happening.
And if not child abuse, then like somebody sexually harassing a teacher or, it's not necessarily that I'm saying that in your school district, somebody's actively abusing children.
Right, yeah.
Although that could be true. But there's somebody who sees sex as an instrument of power who's hurting people that they have power over. And probably it's a man.
Wow. Oh, bad news. Thanks a lot.
Sorry. But I think that's the way to do it, is not just to sort of cluck about, these famous people, but that we have to sort of make that take it home to whatever communities we're part of.
Yeah.
Look around.
Yeah. And I guess as an individual in the family, it could be anything from in age appropriate ways, talking about okay touch and not okay touch, and like all that kind of stuff that you would do in your home. And even
now it's a super great season to enforce with kids and adults alike that like you don't have to kiss and hug anyone you don't want to kiss and hug, right? Like that, the holidays.
Even hug your grandma.
Yeah, exactly. The holidays is like so much for social interaction with people that we like or don't like to different degrees.
That's funny.
Like being able to just set those boundaries for ourselves, if we're grown-ups, or help children set them, and talk to adults, about it in advance if you think it's going to be awkward with kids. Just like practice that each of our bodies is our own, and we are the sovereigns of our own bodies. And you can be nice to people and like people and not feel like kissing or hugging them, and that is super okay. That is a really amazing individual level thing that you can work on, or community level if you consider the family a community, which I think it is.
Yeah. Well, and also because it's members of the family would be engaging with the community, and I would think, it's why communication is essential. And even no matter where you're at, you feel like you don't communicate well, you could still start by you can at any point decide to make your home a safe space for open communication. And just because you didn't do it when they were 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 doesn't mean you can't start when they're a 16-year-old or whatever age.
Start where you are. Yeah. That's your only option anyway.
Yeah.
Right? You cannot go back into the past, but you can change the present and the future.
Right.
That's all any of us can.
Well, and that is an important point, right? So that whether it's a single parent house or a dual parent house or, whatever the milieu is, that you can use these examples, as a way of communication and talk about what you care very deeply about. I've got to think if you're talking to a boy in the house, I care very deeply that you are, the kind of boy who grows into a man who respects all people and integrity and flirting and sexuality and all these great things is going to be awesome, in the right context, and what is happening here is wrong and here's why. Because you've got to assume that with social media or whatever, that kids are seeing all the stuff that we're seeing anyway.
Oh, for sure. And they're seeing people say, I don't get what's wrong with what Louis C.K. did, right? Like, what's the big deal about a man whipping his dick out and starting to masturbate? They're seeing people say that. So it's so important that they hear something else. They hear the answer to that question.
Exactly. And it is just, and I know how I feel with awkward conversations. And I think I'm probably one of the braver ones, like show kids where their vagina is and the clitoris, and this is good feeling, And so I know that I'm one of the braver ones, and I know they're awkward. I think it's easy to just deflect, or I don't have the mental energy to worry about this. And I think that when we keep turning our head the other way, that's when we become complicit, right? And upholding that this shit is going to continue.
Absolutely. Right. That any kind of denial is a bodyguard for the status quo, right? It's sort of like our denial, the things that we just don't want to deal with, it just sort of upholds and takes care of the status quo. And if you're uncomfortable with the way the status quo is, you have to work through your denial. I always tell people, usually this is just about sexual communication with each other, but it applies to all kinds of things. You will not die of awkward, right? It is okay to feel awkward. We all feel awkward about this stuff. So go ahead and feel awkward and then do the thing anyway that you feel awkward about, right? Like just feel awkward. You won't die. It won't kill you.
I love that. I'm going to borrow that. I'm going to remind myself of that. So is anything else that you would have put in the book, like in the sort of hindsight 2020? Because I mean, unless you know an author, there is a considerable long amount of time between when your final MS is in, no more edits allowed, and the shit that can go down between the publishing dates.
I mean, I think that's the big stuff. I definitely would have worked some of this stuff into the chapter about remaking masculinity, but I feel like the themes would stay the same in that chapter for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, if we can hope for any good to come out of the mess, it's that you know, can use the book as a helpful tool that it is, and as a way to talk to the media and podcasters and, you know, and people who can reach other people so that they understand, you know, that this is very much a front of mind current event, matters to our whole cultural flourishing issue.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that, look, I think there are a lot of people right now who are horrified by the relentless headlines about men in power, abusing that power, using sexuality, and asking sort of, how did we get here and how do we get somewhere better? And as it happens, that is literally the question at the heart of my book, right? So that is literally the question that I set out to answer. So I am really hoping that it will be a useful tool for folks.
Yeah, it was very useful for me, even more so that I got to read it in an early copy before all this stuff happened. I was like, oh yeah, I remember reading about this. It's clicking. Yeah. And do you want to share one more time where people can get the book and the name and just any kind of juicy bits coming out?
Yeah. You can find it at getunscrewed.com. There's links to buy it at whatever your favorite places to purchase books are. And the book is called Unscrewed: Women, Sex, Power, and How to Stop Letting the System Screw Us All. And I'm going on tour. Yay! So I don't know when this is going to air, but the book comes out November 14th, and that's the night of my book release in New York at the Pleasure Chest on the Upper East Side. So come to like a book release party at a sex shop. You know you want to. And then after that, I've got a ton more cities and dates. And they're all on the website. If you go to getunscrewed.com and then just click on events, you'll see the whole tour schedule. So I would love to see folks there. Come out, bring your friends. My tour is like my very favorite part of all of this, because I get to like really talk to people about these ideas I've been living with in private for years. And, you know, tell me that you heard about me on the Body Kindness podcast. I would love to meet you.
Oh, that would be so cool. And I think you're coming to DC. Do you remember the date for that off the top of your head?
DC is December 12th. At Potter's House. And that's up on the website too.
Cool. I'm going to come, and this will definitely be out before then. So I'm going to bring some listeners and friends and all that stuff. But that does not sound like a sex toy shop. So we're going to miss out on the vibrant.
It's a sort of bookstore cafe situation. But I think they'll probably like go out afterwards to a bar if folks want to have some shenanigans.
Yeah. Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this little, I guess, bonus mini episode. And then we'll get the full length of what we talked about before, like the cultural sex shit hit the fan.
Amazing. Well, thanks for having me.
Okay. Hey, Jaclyn, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I just really want to dive in and get started. And I'd love for you to tell the listeners a little bit more about the work that you're doing right now.
I mean, my work is centered around what I call sexual liberation, which for me is at the intersection between what mostly gets called sex positivity and anti-sexual violence work. And for me, those are two sides of the same coin, right? You can't really talk about being more sexually free and pleasure-based and all of that stuff without talking about the things that are holding us back, which often is rooted in violence. And you can't really talk about sexual violence without talking about what's being violated, right?
Yeah.
Which is our bodily sovereignty, really. So my work operates at the intersection of those ideas.
Yeah. You know, and I think that a lot of people don't realize the way that women have been oppressed sexually, whether that's, I mean, even in this day and age, and you look at the cover of the magazines, or even when you talk amongst your friends, it's like the number one goal is standard cis and like how to please him and all these things you need to do. It very little of it is centered around sexual activity being mutual, or that our bodies, no matter what they're like, are deserving of receiving pleasure. It's like we've just learned to accept that, you know, we need to look a certain way and act a certain way in order to earn the attention.
Yeah, I think for a lot of women, being sexy has become substituted for being sexual or a sexual actor, right? That we're to be consumed sexually instead of we're the subjects of our own narratives around sex. And it comes down to this idea, this word that I've coined, which is faux powerment, right? So there's a lot of narrative, and a lot of people sort of think, well, aren't women free, right? You know, women can wear whatever they want and et cetera, which isn't really true. And we can get into that. But, you know, we're supposed to have had a sexual revolution, and there are these sort of you go girl signifiers of women being free, and advertisers will sell you on that strong woman idea. But those are all sort of these individualistic glosses on freedom. And in fact, we live in a culture and in a set of interlocking institutions that really do stand in the way of women really standing in the power of our bodies and standing for our own pleasure in whatever way that comes through. You know, my focus is on sexuality, but it is about like whether women get to run our own agendas when it comes to our bodies.
Yeah. And is that what made you want to write your latest book, Unscrewed, was to deal with the power issues?
You know, this is my third book, and each book has kind of come from the last one. So Yes Means Yes, which was my first anthology, which was all about how we can't address sexual violence if we're going to be slut shaming and stigmatizing around women and sexuality, and how we have to heal the sexual culture to do anti-rape work. And at the heart of the Yes Means Yes anthology is the idea of enthusiastic consent, right? That no means no is not enough, that real sexual consent means both partners are actively into whatever's happening, right? That you have to, that yes is just as important as no. And I traveled around when that book came out, and I heard this same question over and over again, which was, and it was specifically from young women, which was, I love the idea of this, but how do I know what I want to say yes or no to, right? That young women and older women also felt so alienated from our own sexual desire because we are raised to be sexually appealing to men, right? That it's not about us running our own agendas, that they didn't know where to start. And so my second book, which is called What You Really, Really Want, is a self-help book. But instead of like most self-help books say, you're broken and this book will tell you how to fix yourself, my book said, the culture's broken, you're fine, but here you're still going to have to try and navigate your sex life in it. You know, here's some ideas about how to do that. And that was really great. And it was sort of like all the advice I want to give my nieces, right? But then I was sort of trying to figure out what to do for my next project and talking it over with some friends. And somebody said, well, what about fixing the culture, right? Like What You Really, Really Want, the second book, takes for granted that the culture is broken. Unscrewed, the new book, is about that doesn't have to be true, right? We are all people in the culture. Culture is Soylent Green. It's made of people. And, you know, what would we need to change to not have such a oppressive sexual culture?
Yeah.
And so, you know, each idea has sort of morphed into the next.
Right. And I think that it's also the progression of awareness when you finally get to the real root of the problem. And absolutely, you want to teach people how to survive in the current culture, because culture can take a long time to really change. But if you never ask the question about what can I do to try to change it, then you're really just leaving the world with the same oppressions that you entered it. And I don't think any of us want to do that.
Yeah, it's like the difference between first aid or emergency care, right? Mm-hmm. And like making your body healthy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Except on a social level, right? So the first aid is like, how do you as an individual survive all the disease in the culture? But ultimately, somebody has to say, well, do we have to have this diseased culture? How could we heal the culture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I loved your book, and I wanted to ask you about a specific story that stood out to me, and it's along the lines of what we talked about now. And it has to do with when you were on the message boards as a sexpert.
Ah, yeah.
And everybody was asking like, well, how can you fix me? How can you make me want sex more? And it was pretty much unanimous that they were doing the self-blaming, like something's wrong with me, kind of like what we were just talking about. And you bring up the idea that a big cultural problem is that we see sexuality as a commodity that we don't own, that husbands own or partners own, and that there's basically not a way for us to really get what we want because we're asking for the wrong thing. You know, we should be asking to take ownership back. So I was wondering if you could elaborate that on me.
Yeah, I was the sexpert in residence for a week at a big message board for moms. It was a mom's site. I'm not going to say which one because honestly, it could have happened anywhere, and I'm not trying to call a particular site out.
Yeah. Well, and as a mom of 2 young girls, I have felt the dry spell of like, you know, no sex. And it's interesting because I would say 99.9 of the negative thoughts in my head were, it's your fault. It's what's wrong with you. And is it, you know, and whether it was because I was also feeling tired and stressed, but there was, you know, I do think that even at where I felt maybe more liberated than I was before, you know, I did my work with body kindness and everything, I definitely felt more liberated. But it's very easy to kind of fall back into that, why don't I want this? There's something wrong with me.
Right, because women are raised, we have the dominant model of sexuality we have in the culture is one that I and other people call the commodity model, where women give it up and men get some. It's all embedded in that sex language, right? And women, we're the product to be consumed in this model. And so, you know, when women are not playing that role that's been assigned to us, we feel like we're faulty products because the whole culture tells us that women are already free. There's no sexism. There's no misogyny. Sexual revolution already happened. And so if something is wrong with your sex life, it's you, right?
Yeah.
It's not other stuff because that other stuff has been solved, didn't you know? Which is obviously not true. And we can talk about those systems.
Yeah.
But that plays out in this profound, like, sort of self-blame and total refusal to look elsewhere for solutions, to like look outside at the situation. And I have a lot of empathy for it because in some ways it feels like if the problem is us, we have some control, whereas it's hard to say the problem is the culture. The problem is these gigantic institutions like the media and our government and churches and things like that. Our economy is part of the problem, the way it's structured. You know, what do you do about that? But I was on this board as an expert and I was like, oh, I'm sure I'll get lots of different interesting questions. And a vast, overwhelming majority of the question was a variation on my sex drive has fallen through the floor. I'm not doing as much sex as I sometimes or always my husband wants. What is the pill I can take for this? Literally, tell me what pill I should take.
Right. Like I should want sex more. I should want to be more sexual. Yeah.
And I should be able to buy something to fix it, right? Like, Like, it's really that granular. And this was before Addie, which is a failure, honestly. Like, most people are not helped by it. But so I didn't even have that. But even if I had, like, I would ask, like, well, are you burning the candle at both ends? You're exhausted, you're stressed. Like, those things affect sex drive. Do you have a sex life with your partner? And it was a very heterosexual board. So I think it was all husbands. Do you and your husband have a sex life where your husband pays attention to your pleasure and cares about your pleasure? Do you have a mutually satisfying sex life when you do have sex? If you don't expect that sex is going to be fun for you, why would you want it?
Do it?
And it was a very frustrating conversation because I didn't feel like I was getting through. Like, they just did not want to look outside and they just wanted a pill. But, and so, Unscrewed is kind of my pitch to these women in some ways. I hadn't really thought about that before, but it is like, it's not you. First of all, sex lives, sex drives, wax and wane for everyone, whether you're a mom or not, right? Like, mine waxes and wanes for sure. All kinds of factors can impact that. And there's no normal sex drive. It's just a question of, like, what works for you and what works for in your relationship if you're in one, right? If you're happy with a low sex drive, you do not have an abnormal sex drive. Like, you're good.
Right.
So there's no, the idea that there's some level that you're supposed to hit that's a myth on its face. But also, there isn't a pill. Like, what we need is a system where women are raised from the start to feel like we are the authors of our own bodies, right? And to have partners who feel that way too. That's a big lift. That's a lot. It's a far away from where we are as a culture. Individually, some of us are lucky and have done a lot of work to try and get closer to that place, and maybe have partners who have too. But, like, on a social level, that is not the trend.
Well, and so I did a masturbation month podcast series in May. Oh yes, it was fun. We had a little challenge for self-pleasure and all this stuff. But one of the things that was clear to me when I got emails from listeners who were very grateful, but they were also, it sounded like they were confessing, and many were 35 to 45 and saying, I'm glad you covered this. By the way, I had the first orgasm in my life ever because I finally got a toy, or something. Like, it was like this whole issue of masturbation is dirty, or, I think that, back to your point about you gotta please the other person. If all your focus is on pleasing someone else, I don't really know how you're going to be able to work with your body to climax anyway. But then also, you're a failure if you don't please them. So let's not pay attention to my needs. And so then you end up faking it, right? So,
that's exactly, from reading my book, that's exactly what happened with me. I had this boyfriend in high school who was, by and large, a good guy. He was a high school boy, but he was okay. And I faked all my orgasms with him because, ironically, it was super important to him that I had orgasms, which you would think would be great. But nobody taught me how to have one. He actually taught me about my clitoris. Nobody did before. And one of my pet peeves, and I talk about this in the book too, is clitorises still are not on a lot of anatomy diagrams when the reproductive system and sex is taught in schools, right? Because most schools, if they're not teaching abstinence only, in which case they're certainly not going to teach the clitoris, most schools teach what sex educators like me colloquially call disaster prevention sex ed, which is basically, you shouldn't have sex, but if you insist, like, here's how to not get a disease and not get pregnant. And you don't have to teach about female pleasure to teach that, right? You teach about doing it with a penis and a vagina. And mostly queer students are left out of that. But the clitoris gets left off those diagrams because you can't talk about the clitoris without talking about women's pleasure. That's what the entire organ is there for.
So that would be a big example right there of a systemic problem that would need to change. If we really want everyone to say, yeah, women are deserving of pleasure, we actually have to know anatomy.
Yeah, we have to know anatomy and we have to know what to do with it, right? Like, so Andy, my high school boyfriend, did teach me the name for my clitoris and like what it was for, but I still couldn't kind of figure out how to have an orgasm. And I didn't know I was supposed to be like deliberately masturbating. I had so much fun with him. Like, I don't want to sound like it was a bad relationship. It was tumultuous in the way teenage relationships can be, but it was fine. It was fun mostly. And I was 19 or 20 when I confessed to a friend of mine at college that I'd never had an orgasm. And she was like, okay, this is what you're doing tonight. You are going home. You are drawing yourself a bath. You are getting nice and relaxed and warm. Maybe light some candles, and then you're going to bed and you're going to touch yourself in this way. And you're going to like follow that funny feeling. And like, if it feels like you're going to pee, keep going. Like, she really like talked me through it. Mm-hmm. And I had an orgasm, and I've never faked one since, because once you know what you're missing, like, why would you deny that to yourself?
Exactly.
But I wasn't faking those orgasms with Andy because I wanted to like lie to him or deceive him. Mm-hmm. I was doing it because he cared about it and I wanted to please him. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have the language to say, I literally don't know how to have an orgasm. I mean, I kind of thought maybe I couldn't have an orgasm, right? Like maybe I'm just not built for orgasms. Mm-hmm. But I just like, and it was fine. I was having a lot of fun. Like, we had a great time, and he was concerned with my pleasure, and I was experiencing pleasure in my body. We should also be clear, orgasms aren't the end all be all of sex, and there's lots of pleasure to be had that has nothing to do with orgasms. But it's because nothing in the culture, nothing in my family, in the media, in schools, or government messages, or in the economy, or my temple, nothing had prepared me to have the language or the framework to advocate for my own pleasure. Like, it just was a giant goose egg. I was not supposed to be having sex anyway. So the idea that I was already doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing, that I was supposed to be like lobbying for myself while doing it, it just didn't even occur to me.
So what is it like? What would it take for, I don't know, I guess we could start picking them off, right? Because I imagine that the media would have a different role than, say, schools or churches, right? Like, I imagine that they maybe would have all their own lens. I mean, is there a unifying like belief that needs to be addressed and unified?
Well, I mean, I think the unifying belief that needs to get shifted in each of those institutions you listed is that women are full, equal human beings, right? And every time I say that, I feel like it sounds snarky, but it's true. Culturally, we are not conceived of as full, co-equal with men, three-dimensional human beings who are sovereign over our lives and our pleasure and our bodies. It really is about, I was going to say restoring women's humanity, but I don't know when in this cultural tradition anyway we've had it, right?
So you can't restore something you never had.
Right. It's about establishing women's sovereign humanity and everything that comes along with it. So, and that plays out so many different ways. Some of your listeners may have heard of the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test?
Yes.
So the Bechdel test in movies, so a movie passes the Bechdel test if it features two female characters who have names, who speak with each other about something other than a man. And I just want you to gender flip it for a minute and think about how low a bar that is, right? Like, that we would celebrate or call out as good, as achieving a movie that featured two male characters with names who at least one point in the movie talk to each other about something other than a woman, right? Like, it's ridiculous, right?
It's crazy.
It's ludicrous. We would have to go search and find movies that fail that, right? And it would be really hard to. So that's how far we are, just take at the media level, from like women being fully seen as fully human.
And it has to do with the idea that the group in power, males, right, needs to be the one that says we are going to support equality.
I certainly am not sitting around waiting for men to do it.
Right.
I would like
how many marches, how many marches and picket signs. I mean, I'm not saying we can't. I think we absolutely need to get angry and do all of that stuff. But when it comes to power, right, how long do we ask for power until
I don't think
they
we
listen?
ask. I think we have to take, right?
Okay.
I think that power almost never, the people in a power position in a culture almost never say, we've decided we don't want all this power. Please have some. Let's share. And there are a lot of great men, individual men who do that. But I'm talking about a social dynamic, right? But I think that there are things we can do to hasten that. So as you know from reading the book, in each chapter of Unscrewed, I take on an institution or a cultural force that I think is in the way of women standing in our full sovereign sexual power. And there's a chapter on men and masculinity, because of course masculinity is one of those institutions, right? The idea of what it means to be a man is so often defined as, power over a woman, right? And whether that's from a we have to protect the fragile ladies place, or an abusive, aggressive place, it's still that power over framework. And one of the things that we can do that I would love to see a mass movement to do is just raise boys to think women are cool, right? So I talk in Unscrewed about this great book, which is called Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. And I kind of hate bagging on it because it's great. But that title drives me around the bend, right? It's a book full of stories about amazing women with these beautiful illustrations. They're written as fairy tales. It's a great book. But why is a book full of stories about amazing women just for girls? Why? Right. There's this profound assumption that girls can identify with boy stories, right? And are expected to, but that we never expect boys to identify with girl stories. But, I have these nephews who are 3.5 now. And when they were 2, my partner and I gave them this board book called Rad American Women A to Z.
Yeah, I have that book for my girls, and it's awesome.
Yes, it's so great. And I have no problem with giving it to girls, obviously, but
boys are the ones who really need to see it, I think, is your point.
And they loved it, right? They don't know any different. They don't know they're not supposed to like girl stuff. Right. They're 2, and their parents haven't given them that message, and so they would run around being like. You could point at a picture and they'd be like, that's Dolores Huerta, that's Kate Bornstein. And it was amazing, and that's going to form part of what they understand about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. If they are raised to think women are interesting and cool and 3-dimensional, we could do a huge culture change, I think, if we start with the parenting of boys.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is such an important point to bring about, is that it's once your eyes are open and you can accept that culture isn't set in your favor, and how I loved how you're talking about, so we take it back. Well, what are the different ways we do that? Well, we start with places where we can control. And so yes, directly any parent, especially parents of boys, right? But the girls need to be taught you're equal too. So I've got 2 young girls, and so
whatever
that's
gender your kids are.
Exactly.
You're raising your kids gender neutral. That's great too. Everybody needs to be raised to think girls are cool. Right.
And then, but I think what I'm getting at too is you talked about having nephews, right? So if you're the favorite aunt or uncle, or I would venture to guess that even there's a role that teachers play and a role that coaches play, that if your life influences children, there is a way that you can take a reasonable action to help teach women's humanness and the value and importance of equality. And so you don't have to be in the Sunday school, hey, boys and girls, here's the clit, but you can. Although that would be interesting.
Can I tell you a hilarious story?
Go for it.
So I just recorded the audiobook for Unscrewed last week. And after I read the chapter about sex ed, which does talk about the clit and whether it's on the anatomy diagrams, that I came in the next day and I was chit-chatting with the director for the audiobook. And she said that she is a 14-year-old girl, I think. She said, I was chasing her around last night being like, did they teach you about the clit in school? I was like, oh my God.
That is so funny. I mean,
everybody picks their moments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think that, I can just see, I don't know. I mean, even in my own family, like I got a book for my girls that Peggy Orenstein recommended to me when she was on the show, and it's called It's Not the Stork. And I love that book. And, I'll read it in bits and pieces to my girls. And so they know vulva, they know anus, they know vagina. And it's because Peggy was right. Like, she's like, it's no different than when you teach the elbow. And so it's like, that's a really good point. And then, I was saying that to a family member, and then it was just like, oh my God, well, to eat, it's whatever you do, but like, what if they say something to somebody else at school and da-da-da? And I think the assumption.
About a vulva? Like,
well,
what?
I know. I think there's this assumption that it's automatically perverted, or it's automatically gross, or it's automatically going to create a problem. And I think that's part of the issue, is that just because certain things in our culture are normalized does not make them normal. And so, sure, parents don't want other people controlling their kids. If you're a parent, you've got to figure out how you want to raise your kids and understand the cultural implications for why you need to help the boys raise girls up, and why we need to teach the accurate body parts. But then there's all these other areas where you can make a positive impact without necessarily, I don't know, making people uncomfortable.
And sometimes you have to make people uncomfortable. Like, honestly, we don't change the culture without making people uncomfortable.
So give me an example. Give me an idea. What if you could wave your wand, what are 3 things that you would just have happen?
Oh, wait, that's my question from the epilogue. You're throwing it at me. Okay. I think that here's something that makes people very uncomfortable. Talking about sex work, right? There's so many opinions, and it just feels like such a third rail. Like, are sex workers victims? Are they dirty whores, right? Like, all of that stuff. And if we could destigmatize sex work and see sex workers for who they are, which are mostly women, although not exclusively women, who are doing a job that a lot of people don't want to do, that's dangerous and illegal. And each of them has reasons. A lot of them are economic. They don't have better options. There are some people who like the work. A lot of people don't. But, a lot of people don't like agricultural work or McDonald's, working at McDonald's either, right? If we could destigmatize that and just sort of let's all admit to ourselves that this is a job that there's a market for and that people do, not only would we make life so much better for sex workers, which for me feels like enough of a reason, but the idea of the whore, right, which is just sort of like the extension of the idea of the slut, it sort of goes even deeper, is used to police all women, right? The idea of the whore being an abject woman who you would not want to be. Like, there's a line and you better not cross that line. But even even having that line is exerting control over. And if that idea had no more power, we would all be so much freer, right? Like, if no one could tell you were acting like a whore, right? Like, think about how pervasive that idea is and how much fear we have of crossing whatever that imaginary line is. I was really surprised. One of the things I learned in doing the research for Unscrewed is that sex workers shame each other depending on where they are in what's called the whorearchy. Which I know is such a great word. I kind of wish it was like a form of government, but instead it's a whore hierarchy, right? So like the high class call girls who work for a lot of money look down on the street workers, and in between you've got people who work in porn who have the benefit of their work being legal, but who have the sort of permanent stigma of like there being a public record of it, right? There's all kinds of folks in between, and they judge each other. I spent in each of the chapters, I profile a person or group that I think is doing great work to change the institution that chapter focuses on. Because I didn't want the book to just be like, here's what's wrong.
Life sucks. And it's good. Like, you wanted people to see that there are actionable solutions that are happening.
People are doing stuff already, and you could join them in any number of ways. And so I spent some time in DC at this organization called HIPS, which is a direct service organization that helps out folks who have done or do street level sex work and or are drug users. And I sat on this support group, and so many of them were like, I used to do sex work and I'm not doing it anymore. And I mentioned that to the director of the program when I interviewed her afterwards. And she said that even here at a drop-in center for street-involved sex workers and drug users, there's stigma if you're actively working. Like, everybody says they're not working, even though some of them are, because they're still judging each other. So if we could let go of that shame about, oh, I'm not doing the right thing with my body sexually. Like, the only wrong thing you can do with your body sexually is hurt someone else. Outside of that, if it's making you happy and nobody's getting hurt, like, there's nothing wrong. And if we could let go both of internalizing that shame and of shaming and policing each other, that would transform the culture.
I'm curious. I mean, I guess there's fewer male sex workers than female sex workers, but are they respected more? Is it a different yardstick with?
I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Well, we'll have to research it.
That's a good question.
Another book idea.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really interesting question.
But I mean, I would just be, I could just see that, to me, it translates.
We see that, right?
Yeah.
Like, we see, like, the idea of the gigolo, right? Is not treated with the same.
He's a player.
Disgust.
He can get, he can get it whenever he wants, but then
it's sort of titillating and like, So certainly when we see it represented in pop culture, it's treated with more respect.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I'm just my mind is kind of blown right now, feeling like that's a deep, big ask, because doesn't that cross religious beliefs and do we know when the first whore was named? Isn't this like a deep, deep, deep issue?
Look, Jesus was cool with sex workers. Right?
There you go. Okay, you're right.
I feel like it depends on how you practice your religion.
Okay, cool. So, and I think that's an important point too, is that, being in today's world and being a person of faith and you should still have a sense of freedom to advocate for things that you want to advocate for without feeling like you're going to lose your religion too. Because I think there's a big fear among people of faith, if I support gay marriage or equal rights, that then I'm gonna lose this community that I care deeply about.
Yeah, well, and I think we have to talk about the role of religion, and specifically the religious right, the right wing of the Christian church, in the way there's a whole chapter devoted to the way that the religious right is tied up in the government. And here in the US, that's not supposed to happen, right? We're supposed to have separation of church and state, right? This is not supposed to be a theological state. But specifically, the religious right and the Republican Party got into bed with each other in the sort of late 70s and have not looked back. And so much of our government regulations around the way we run our sex lives are actually being authored by the religious right, which I also have religious freedom in this country, right? Like, I'm Jewish, right? I shouldn't be having to live according to somebody else's religion. Like, if you genuinely believe your religion says you shouldn't be a sex worker, then don't be a sex worker.
Right.
But your religion, I don't think, if you look at the actual text, will tell you should shame and stigmatize them.
Got it. Yeah.
And there are people fighting back against the religious right's influence over sex ed, right? So if you look at all the abstinence curricula that are taught in public schools with public money all over the country, most of them are written by hardcore right-wing Christian groups and teach that girls are responsible for men getting turned on and all kinds of gross stuff. So the education level, public dollars, yours and mine, if you're a U.S. taxpayer, our public dollars are going to pay through welfare, right? Through money that's supposed to go to needy families, to poor people, to help them pay their bills and feed their families, are getting diverted by the states through the block grant system to pay for heterosexual marriage promotion, to pay for crisis pregnancy centers, which trick women who are seeking abortions and shame them and terrify them into not getting abortions, to all kinds of stuff that is run explicitly by the religious right. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
would that be one of your big 3 things that need to happen too? So stop slut shaming, and we need to free sex workers and destigmatize it. Would the separation of religious right and government be
to re-separate the church and state? Oh, absolutely. Yes, that would go a huge way to our sexual freedom. If we could genuinely sever the church and the state here in the U.S., that would make an enormous difference. It would be enormous. And there are groups, the woman I profile in that chapter who's wonderful, her name is Cherise Scott, and she runs an organization in Memphis, Tennessee that she founded called Sister Reach, which is a reproductive justice advocacy organization. But one of her main thrusts is teaching clergy how to support reproductive justice using the Bible. And so they're inherently fighting back against the idea that Christianity is this monolithic anti-sex, institution, right? They're using Christianity to stand up for women's sovereignty. And so, there's a ton of examples out there. Like, we don't have to believe that this one way that we've been living in is the only way. There are a ton of Christians who believe in each of our sovereignty, right? Like, they're just not the ones who are tied up with the government.
Well, that's another huge problem.
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge problem. And it gets into voting rights and gerrymandering and stuff that you wouldn't think would have a lot to do with sort of like body image and sex, right? Like, one of the reasons that it's hard to vote them out and do anything about it, even though they don't represent anything resembling the majority of the country's views, is because, our voting rights are being impinged in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Oh, I don't even want to talk about gerrymandering. I think that drives me insane. Yeah. So just almost like a quick tip for the first 2, even though, real solutions would be, fully committed to taking consistent action. But like, I'm just thinking of, something, practical for listeners. And my guess is you're probably, for the first one, like my girls are 3 and 5. They haven't learned the word slut or whore yet. So we're good there. But so I'm assuming a little bit older, and maybe you are catching up with your kids, or, there's somehow are hearing the words or see the opportunity to address the words. Like, would that would be an example of an action that you could take of, to say, hey, whether they're sharing something with you, whether they got called a name, their friend got called a name, or they're the one, that is calling a name, that by having a conversation about that and why.
I don't think you even have to wait until the names are spoken, right? I think absolutely address it if that language comes up. But if your kids are judging other kids by what they're doing with their bodies and what feels good to those other kids, like, that's the same idea, right? It doesn't even have to be about sex or sexuality, right? Like, if somebody's like, ew, they like eating peas, right? Like, it's literally the same idea. Like, it's fine. If they like eating peas and it's not hurting anyone, it's not your business, right? Like, we should all enjoy and let people like what they like. I don't know if you've heard the phrase, don't yuck on somebody else's yum.
Yeah, I love that phrase.
It, like, literally, that's all we're talking about around slut shaming. Right?
I love it.
Right? Like, it's that idea. So we find opportunities to teach that idea,
right,
and to teach kids and yourself, because God knows adults need this too, like, that your pleasure, whatever makes you feel good, matters, even if it doesn't map with what you think it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's an excellent point because that's going to then help you change your own belief system, right? Because if you believe you're not worthy of pleasure, well, you've got to give yourself the pleasure to eventually change that belief system, and then you're changing and transforming. So it's almost like you have to do that thing that you don't think you deserve anyway.
Yeah. And, I do think a lot of the shaming and policing that happens is fear-based, which is to say, like, there's a set of correct ways to behave. And if I follow those rules, I'm going to be fine. No one's going to hurt me. I'm good. I'm safe. I'm okay. And so that's not, unfortunately, true, right? I wish, in some ways, I wish that were true, although it would also be a limiting set of things. But like, a lot of people ask me for parenting advice around sexuality, and young kids are not my expertise. I don't have kids. It's not my area. I obviously have nieces and nephews, and I'm not an idiot, but it's not my specialty. But what I think is true, regardless, is, kids learn a lot more from watching you than from the words you say. So I would also say, like, look at yourself if you're worried about what you're teaching your kids in terms of their values. Look for the places where you still maybe do look down on sex workers or think they're bad or wrong or something, or people who you think of as sluts or doing sex wrong in one way or another. Become aware of your own implicit biases and work on those. And you're going to be a great model for your kids.
Yeah. That intersects even with body image and size diversity and all that, which listeners are, I talk about all the time on the show. So that really resonates with me, and it makes complete sense. Then with respect to the second thing you'd love to change with the religious right being intertwined with the government, is voting, getting more involved in politics. Is that where you direct people for that one, or what could we do on the regular to help?
I mean, I think there's probably two different ways to go depending on the person. Yes, absolutely. Not just voting, but making sure you're supporting candidates who stand up to the religious right, that you're not supporting candidates in terms of dollars or volunteer time or votes who are in bed with the religious right. Like, you want to ask about their opinion, even at the school board level, right? Or at the town council or state senate. It doesn't always have to be presidential elections. In fact, a lot of this stuff gets decided on the district and state and community level. How do they feel about sex? What should be taught for sex ed in public schools, right? Is it okay to teach kids that sex can feel good, right? Like, is it okay to acknowledge that sex can be pleasurable?
I mean, I think they do in other countries.
Yeah. Well, when we don't acknowledge that sex can be pleasurable, we especially leave sexually vulnerable kids, so mostly I'm talking about girls and queer students, really extra vulnerable, because the media, the culture is going to tell cisgender boys that sex is awesome for them, right?
Yeah.
And that they should expect it to feel awesome. But other kids are not getting that message. And when we don't talk about expecting pleasure in schools, then we don't teach them to expect pleasure. And so then if they have sex partners who are abusive or even just don't care about them or their pleasure in bed, they're going to think that's normal. They're not going to have learned to expect anything else. We're really, really undermining them and leaving them much more vulnerable than they need to be. So advocating for change in the way we teach sex ed, even though that's a totally different chapter in the book, but that certainly flies in the face of the religious right agenda. Yeah. But also, if you are involved in a church, and especially a Christian church, although whatever your religion is, you could do this, is sort of get involved on the church or temple or mosque or whatever your house of worship is, get involved on that level and see what the values are that are getting taught in your place of worship. And if you can have influence over that, the Bible doesn't say word one about abortion, which I was shocked to learn. I'm Jewish. What do I know? But it doesn't say anything about abortion. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't know that from listening to the religious right. So one thing that you can do also is educate yourself. Like, this is so hard, but don't necessarily assume that your clergy or the clergy you were raised with are the whole entire word on what is actually in the texts of your religion. You can read them for yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like you said, Jesus was washing the feet of the homeless and the whores and everybody. So if that's really, and I think there's so much judgment that is shrouded in religious belief that's very, very toxic as well.
Yes. Yeah. And that's not necessarily in the sort of core religious texts. Mm-hmm. You know, people
they edited in what they wanted.
Religions are institutions. They're not just value systems, right? Yeah. And they're also made of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you have a third magical wish?
Well, we did already talk about remaking masculinity and starting with kids, right?
Okay, so that would be your third to just to reinforce.
If I can only have 3, I guess.
Well, that's already a big list. I mean, it's and that's the thing, you know, and I think to your point, I think people could feel overwhelmed. You know, it's not easy to face the problems because like when I was reading, it was like, you know, in several of the stories, it just pulls at your heart or, you know, makes you upset. It makes you angry. And it was helpful to read more about actions that are being taken. But I think it is easy to get so upset with the current state of things that we just say, oh, well, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to, you know, shut down, tune it out. And A, I think you're in a privileged position if you're able to do that. But B, then you're not doing anything to solve the problems, you know? And so that's what I would like listeners to get away from this is to really be aware and understand that there are many things that impact your day-to-day choices, what value and worthiness you feel like you bring to the world, and your even sense of agency and being able to create change and make a difference.
Well, and it's not all or nothing, mm-hmm. right? There's a phrase from the Jewish tradition that has guided me through my activism since I was a teenager that I used to end the book, which is, it is not yours to complete the work, neither is it yours to desist from it, right? So don't think that you either have to solve one of these huge problems we just described or not do anything at all, right? Like, is there something on a human level scale that you can break down, you know, like, can you call somebody on the school board and inquire what's getting taught at your school about sex ed?
Yeah.
That's something you might be able to do, right? Like, can you have a talk with your pastor, right? Can you think about the young boys you know and think about a way to introduce stories about amazing women to them? Like, these are not – I think a lot of the time we think about the people who change the world as like heroes who are just superhuman. And
dedicate their life to, you know, So it's little actions. They might seem insignificant, but they matter because it's going to impact your family and your community.
And that's everything. Mm-hmm. That's everything. Do the piece that you can do, that you're interested in doing, that you're motivated to do, and trust that it's not all on your shoulders.
Yeah. Well, it has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you giving me the time today. Again, the book is called Unscrewed: Women's Sex Power and How to Stop Letting the System Screw Us All. Jaclyn, thank you for coming on. How can people find you and where can they get the book?
Oh, yeah. It was such a pleasure. This is such a fun conversation. If you go to getunscrewed.com, there's a portal where you can decide which way you want to order the book, whether that's through your independent bookstore or online retailers or however you like to do it. And you can read more about the book. You can read some of the early reviews, that kind of stuff. So that's probably the best place to get the book. But really, you can pre-order it from anywhere you like that sells books. I mean, you know, probably your dentist won't have it.
And there's going to be an audiobook version, which is awesome because I love listening, and you have a wonderful voice. So I can't wait to listen. I got the pleasure of reading and earmarking, but I can't wait to listen as well.
Yay. And people can find me on Twitter and Facebook at Jaclyn F. That's Jaclynf as in Friedman. And on Instagram, although my Instagram is more personal. So if you want to see like food I make and places I travel, it's not very political. You can find me there at Jaclyn Effable. What else do I want to say? Is that everything? Oh, I should also mention that I have a podcast too.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Which is also called Unscrewed and is about, all of these issues. It's an interview show, a lot like yours, where I talk to somebody about something they're doing to unscrew the sexual culture. So people can subscribe to that wherever they like to get their podcasts, and would love to hear from your listeners that way as well.
Oh, that's all great. And I'll include all those links and important tidbits in the show notes as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
And that's the episode. If you have your own body betrayal story, I'd love to hear it. Please shoot me an email at rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. That's REBECCA @bodykindnessbook.com. And let's continue the conversation in my free Facebook group. Search Body Kindness Podcast on Facebook and request to join. And if you like listening, please leave a rating and review or tell a friend. If you'd like to hear how you can get signed Body Kindness books for gifts for the holiday season or special events, email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.